everybody. My name is Sarah Charters. I'm the president of the United Church of Canada Foundation. And I am so pleased to be here with you all today and appreciate you taking the time. And as we get going, I just want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the east end of Toronto, which is the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Wendat and Petun First Nations. And as I say that, I also think about what that means for us here currently, what the situation is, what the context is, what the treaties that govern this area were intended to be, and how we might make that more fully realized in the here and now. So I would encourage you, as you think about where you are joining from, to think about not just acknowledging where you are, but what you might do with that knowledge. And with that, I'm very excited, very pleased to introduce the Reverend Dr. Catherine Faith MacLean, who is going to moderate today's panel. Catherine is a senior minister at St. Paul's United in Edmonton and has served churches across the country. She is a writer and a teacher and a theologian, and is currently offering leadership to Revitalize, which is a conference happening down east fairly soon, actually. And the Then Let Us Sing hymnal that's coming up in celebration of the 100th anniversary of the church. She has a lot of accolades, a lot of experience, and she also serves on the Foundation's Scholarship and Academic Awards Committee. So, Reverend Dr. MacLean, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's still morning here in Edmonton, and this is where I live as part of Treaty 6, and our congregation has a burgeoning relationship with the Papa Chase Cree, and in particular, a healing and sacred site that is within walking distance of our building. It's my pleasure to moderate today. I will introduce to you our three guests, our three panelists, and then they will have opportunity to share with you about their experiences with Foundation scholarships. The Reverend Dr. Ross Bartlett is an ordained United Church minister. He is currently serving as Formation Director and Adjunct Faculty at the Atlantic School of Theology. Sparked by the experiences of graduates, he has been researching and teaching in the area of partially funded and bivocational ministry. A previous grant from the Foundation supported the creation of his first book in this area. The title is It's Real Ministry: How Part-Time and Bivocational Clergy Are Challenging and Empowering the Church. Ross was awarded the Rowntree Scholarship in 2022, enabling his research into best practices in partially funded ministry. The Reverend Bill Millar was pastor of Knox, Winnipeg for 14 years, during which it emerged as perhaps the most culturally diverse United Church congregation. Bill was awarded the McGeachy Senior Scholarship in 2016 to focus on pragmatics of intercultural ministry, resulting in the podcast series Open Out. He is currently an interim pastor at Broadway Disciples United, a Filipino intercultural blended United Church and Disciples congregation. The Reverend Alexa Gilmour is a human rights activist, social entrepreneur, preacher, prophet, and author. She was awarded the McGeachy Senior Scholarship in 2020 and is currently completing both that work and a doctorate of ministry from the University of California, Berkeley. If Alexa isn't at work, she is giggling over a good joke with her spouse and their 4 children, or hiking through provincial parks. Ross Bartlett, would you please share a little bit about yourself and your research?
Okay, I have been in ministry in congregations in a variety of places over 35 plus years, and most recently at the Atlantic School of Theology. And our students are both on campus and in the summer distance program. And many of them will likely be serving partially funded ministries for much of their careers. And I realized a few years ago that I didn't know very much about that in detail, although I had served one many years ago. And as I started to look at how we might better equip our students, I discovered that the United Church didn't know much about what the reality was either. So in order to fund a way of discovering that, made an application to the foundation, which they graciously supported. We were able to conduct the first Canada-wide survey of United Church partially funded ministers, which generated quite a bit of data, which was wonderful. And we followed that up with 9 or 10 in-person interviews with folks who seemed to typify certain groups that I emerged from the data. That gave us a more personal and fleshed, if you like, aspect of the research, which was great. And people were so gracious with their time. And so that generated the first book and some seminars that have come out of that. And then we realized that there are some good ways and some less helpful ways of going about partially funded ministry. And so moving into a second phase, trying to learn from those who are getting it right. In other words, they're healthy, they're vibrant, both clergy and congregation, and they're making an impact in their community and their world. So that's where we're at now.
Thank you, Ross. Bill, will you share a little bit about yourself and your research, please?
Sure. The research was based on work at Knox, which over the 14 years I was there went from being about 85% white and old to being about 85% diverse. I came into that ministry after I worked for 12 years in a unique model of ministry, the staff model, where I worked for the presbytery as their interim minister and was deployed annually in congregations. And before that, I came in with some cross-cultural experience with about 12 years in deaf ministry. But the research was based on Jonathan from Schmidt at one point asked a question at a seminar where there were people from Knox saying, so why did it work at Knox, this intercultural, when it doesn't seem to work in so many places? And really that research was about that. So it was both qualitative and also extensive research to try to figure out what are the pragmatics of actually making intercultural work. How do you deal with power issues, all of that? So it really grew out of that context. I'm not an academic. I'm just really about trying to be a practical application of that.
Thank you very much, Bill. Alexa, will you share, please, a little more about yourself and your research?
Yeah, I'm happy to. In terms of my own journey, I love following the Spirit into adventures. They inevitably end up in miracles. And so what I was really interested in was when I started at a new church, started Occupy happened. And so I was Christmas, there was a knock on our door, and a Roma family needed sanctuary in our church for a year and a half. Otherwise,
sorry, Alexa. Alexa,
more we answered these calls and went out into deeper, our faith grew. Yeah,
Alexa, sorry to interrupt. Yeah,
right.
Could you maybe turn your video off, and then maybe that will give you a little more bandwidth, and we can hear you better.
I will do that. I'm so sorry. And what I'll do is I'll also try coming in on my phone in a minute for the next question. Is this giving you better bandwidth?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So the area of research that was really captivating me was actually in I sort of call it the resurrected body of Christ, and taking very seriously the Emmaus story when the early disciples didn't recognize Christ on the road or Christ in the upper room. The way in which our church might be dying, but the body of Christ is resurrecting. We won't understand it at first or see it, but it has key gospel characteristics that Jesus had. It will feed and care for creation. It will lay down its life in service to God and neighbor rather than be beholden to institutions and buildings. It'll help God birth the beloved community during this very painful time of increased division, hate crimes on the rise, corporate greed on the rise, war, climate change. And I think it's found in the going out of our buildings and into the streets. So I'm seeing this need. I'm seeing this response that actually feeds the soul and allows us as Christians to live out the gospel. And the research specifically is discovering what those needs are, where God is at work in the neighborhoods, and how congregations do that work for themselves, looking at where the need is and how they go out from the pews into the streets. And we tested this in our own congregation, and now I'm looking to share that research.
Thank you very much, Alexa. Thank you. And it is good to be able to listen clearly to you. And if the phone is going to work to bring your image, that will be wonderful. And in the meantime, we're able to hear you well, and your projects are so very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ross, I have two questions for you that I will pose together because they go together. First of all, what inspired you to do your research? You spoke a bit about that, but maybe you could open it up a little bit, and what the goals were for your project, and maybe they've changed and pivoted with the research that you've been doing across the denomination.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. As I said, my research initially grew out of my own lack of knowledge and therefore my incapacity to help students who are heading into ministry. And I guess like anybody who's been around the courts of the church for a while, I recognized that we were approving part-time calls and appointments all the time. But it hadn't really gelled for me how much that had increased. And so at one point, and the folk at the General Counsel Office had been very helpful in our research. At one point, October of 2021, 57% of vacancies on Church Hub were part-time. And that's an incredible leap from not too long ago. And so we have students who are entering into ministry, and they will be spending their time. Much of them will spend at least a portion, if not all of their ministry in partially funded ministry. And so we wanted to do a couple of things. First of all, we wanted to capture the experience of clergy who are in such situation. What's working for them? What isn't? What are the good things? What are the challenges? What do they wish they had learned when they were going through their training for ministry? And then the second was to make that information available to folk so that they would know that if they were in a situation like that, or if they were, as a congregation, contemplating that step, they'd have some data and maybe even learn from other people's mistakes, so they had room to make their own. And so that is what we started out to do, and discovered a couple of really interesting things that probably shouldn't have surprised us, that there is a portion of those who are in part-time ministry who really like it. I mean, it's a real calling for them. 49% of those in partially funded ministry wouldn't be in full-time ministry, even if it was a possibility. And so we need to find a way of honoring that. As well, there are people who are doing it not because they want to, but because they have to. And the other thing that we sort of brought to the surface was that in our denomination, in many of our circles, in many of our organization and decision-making bodies, we have a very much a full-time bias, that a real minister is full-time. And many of the people that we spoke to told absolutely heartbreaking stories about how they had been denigrated. They felt denigrated by colleagues and by the church because they were not in full-time ministry. The idea is that if you are really into this, if you were really faithful, you'd be full-time. And that's an assumption that flies in the face of the growing reality. And so having developed that, we also discovered that in the course of our research, that there were some groups and some congregations, some individuals where, as I said earlier, the congregations were thriving, not necessarily growing in numbers. Numbers aren't the only measurement, but they were having an impact in their community. They were growing younger. They were all sorts of things were changing. And then there were those where they were just carrying on, and there really wasn't much felt hope for the future. And so we wanted to, in the next step, try and figure out, okay, what was working? Was it just a special thing in each context, or were there best practices that can perhaps be replicated across the church so we can learn from one another? And my conviction is that the people who are doing it are our best teachers. And so I wanted to try and bring their stories forward.
Thank you very much. It's so interesting to learn the genesis of your projects and what got you going and how things changed. So, Bill, in terms of the inspiration for your research and your initial goals, will you speak to that, please? And maybe some areas or spots where you needed to change or pivot or open in a different fashion.
Yeah, I hit on this somewhat. I mean, Knox is in a high-density urban neighborhood just behind downtown Winnipeg. And it was for many, many years the first landing site for new immigrants, primarily refugees. And so what happened was that we were transformed to become what the neighborhood already was in that process. And the interesting question then is what helped us to do that. We had never heard of intercultural as we began that. A guy who had just started at General Council named Michael Blair showed up one day and said, "Did you know that the United Churches just voted to become what Knox is?" And he made out okay too. One of the realities was that this was a huge building. I mean, it's a gigantic building right across from a park, which was the haven of drug users at that point. And so there were two different facets that happened to this. One was in terms of just engaging with the neighborhood around. It was culturally diverse. At that point, it was heavily Somali and West African. So there were two different components. One of it was the development of the intercultural. The other was the re-envisioning of church as public space, not as private space, and engaging with the park as public space in a kind of a relationship. That isn't a part of this, but it was an important part of the ministry. So in that process of doing that, we simply began organically to become. The genesis of it actually was we had a group that met for a year discerning a new call. And so we met every Wednesday for 6 months, I'm exaggerating, about 6 months for prayer and discernment and pizza. And then at the end of 6 months, we were all sick of pizza and had no discernment whatsoever. So we came up with a 5 simple things. We believed that we thought, one, we have no clue what God is calling us to do. 2, we believe that God actually does know what God is calling us to do, and God isn't going to be intentionally difficult about this, wants to communicate it to us. And the most likely way at this point that's going to happen is it's just going to walk through the door And so we would be open to any idea that walked through the door. And literally, pretty much that's what happened. We began that process of re-envisioning the church as public space. We engaged with community in the development of markets. And it was really out of those initiatives. So the congregational change, Knox was larger than the congregation. And so the congregational change happened following that. And my interest really was what enabled the church, the members of the church, the existing church. They told me when I went there that the average age is 65. Yeah, they count 65 in a funny way. The average age was about 85. But what enabled the church to make that transformation? And so that was really about it. And it really was, I guess the other piece of this that's a motivation for me is that I believe that that's where the renewal of our church happens, is from the margins, from those who are disenfranchised, from those who are the ethnic, from the new Canada and engagement. And we are among the most monolithic and intentionally, it seems to me, monocultural of institutions in our history, even though our language was different. But our attitude was really purely individual culture, intelligentsia. And so it was about what can enable folk like us to open to diversity. And that was really, and I don't think that goal changed. The method of delivery changed, but I think the goal remained the same.
Thank you, Bill. This is just fascinating, the work that you're doing there and how it resonates with things I'm hearing across the church. So gosh, what you're doing in your research is going to enlighten the rest of us, and does enlighten the rest of us. Alexa, if you speak for a moment, please, about what inspired you to do the research and the goals you had, and maybe how that has shifted as you've been doing your work.
Absolutely. So let me know if the video goes out, somebody, or if it's cutting in and out, and I'll just go to audio. I'm in one of those old church stone buildings, and we have Wi-Fi, but whether it gets to you or not is sometimes tricky. Speaking of how the Spirit sometimes also, bounces around before it gets to us. I have been really fascinated and passionate about a ministry that's informed by what they're calling now intersectional theory, which is showing you how there's an interconnected nature to all of the social categories like race or gender or class, sexual orientation, ability, and how these various intersections overlap to further disadvantage some people more than others. So a Canadian example of that would be, for every dollar made by a white man in Canada, a white woman makes 87 cents. A racialized man makes 78 cents. A racialized woman makes 67 cents, right? So these intersecting categories increase or decrease one's advantages. And so I was really interested in seeing how the church could live into these spaces of justice, answer the call of our neighbors in our churches that are intersectional spaces. We have all of these people in our spaces. We want, our age and class and gender and race and all of that, but also in the neighborhood. And then on top of that, I was starting to see how the effects of things like the coronavirus and not so new issues like climate change and discrimination is intensifying those whom Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount prioritized, right? And I started to ache, like, what in God's name are we as a church supposed to do with the gifts that we have individually and collectively in this particular time and in this particular space? And so, yes, my research had to change dramatically, because my idea was that I would go to the front lines of activism, create these podcasts, bring all of that back to the pews, have these great conversations in study guides and other things. Again, then from that, churches would be inspired to go out into their local areas and become active as well. I put my application in for the McGeachy March 15th. The world shut down 2 days later, March 17th, 2020. Nobody was going anywhere. Nobody was doing study lessons. And digital ministry came up in that period of time. churches started to really seriously decline. And so where it's shifted for me is I'm looking at creating online spaces where the 2 people in this church that are passionate but can't get together a committee, and the 3 people over here, and the 1 person over there, and the 17 over here can actually move together, talk together about these issues. So the portal will have ways in, like if climate change is your thing, or if poverty is your thing, gender and justice, but they intersect and we understand how they interact with each other. It'll have ways to engage locally with your own community, ways to quickly feed out information. So, there's a march at 3 p.m. tonight, everybody out. So people will have signed up ahead of time. They'll get that notice, so that we can actually get those in the congregations that are passionate and interested in becoming active and living out their faith, ways to do it. One of the things I've discovered is that people really want to help. Really, really want to. And Stone Soup Network, which was one of the projects that I've been working on for 6 years, showed that they just didn't know how. So you give them the portals and the ways in, and miracles can happen.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We're learning about the 3 areas of ministry and research and passion that you are each bringing out of something that you see and you're offering to the wider church. So we want to go a little bit deeper now into your work, now that we have these answers. Go a little bit deeper into your work. And
sorry for interrupting you.
Yes.
This is NASA. If I don't mind, if I can talk for 2 minutes, is that okay?
We'll have time for that at the
no
end.
No problem. Thank you so much.
We'll get to that at the end. We want to hear from our presenters first, because they have prepared thoughts and are bringing things to you that you haven't heard yet. So there'll be time at the end. Ross, you've talked a bit about the needs across the church that your research was addressing, but if you could speak a bit more about who those findings were geared to, but specifically, what are you finding? What have you been lifting up? What formats have you been using? What media, perhaps? But what are you finding that you're bringing to us?
Okay. In trying to bring it in a couple of different ways, one of the things that we discovered was that it's not just a matter of preparing clergy and ministry personnel to serve in partially funded ways. And I use partially funded and for a very specific reason, raised by the folk we were talking to. Part-time sounds like you're only partially invested. Partially funded refers to the number of hours for which you're being paid. And so I've never yet met somebody who was a pastor of a congregation who really punched a clock in their own heart. They were always involved and always committed, regardless of how many hours they were paid for. So I moved to partially funded in part to raise up that reality. What we discovered was that as well as preparing partially funded clergy, we have to also give some thought to preparing communities of faith, because the realities are very different. And what happens in many places is that communities sort of crash into partially funded ministry after they've run out of resources, after they run out of energy, and they move into this very new way of being at probably the worst time, without any preparation about how this ministry is going to change and challenge and perhaps empower them. And so I was talking to somebody actually earlier today about a potential podcast around how to give a toolkit or a preparation time to congregations that have this in their future, or think they do. One of the things we learned was that for the second partially funded minister in a place has an easier time than the first one. And that's because the first one is dealing with a whole host of assumptions. And we all know about assumptions. They're the things we don't articulate. But when you have somebody who is partially funded, for instance, you just can't arbitrarily pick a day to have a funeral if you expect your minister to be there, because often if they are partially funded, they have another form of employment. Because a portion of a United Church minister's salary doesn't always satisfy the landlord. And the fact that I'm employed half-time doesn't mean that my landlord only wants half the rent. So there are economic realities here too. But there are also positives. This is not just the negative. And one of the interesting outgrowths of this is the way in which partially funded ministry helps to empower and enliven and reawaken laity gifts for the ministry which is theirs. This idea of a full-time minister serving a congregation is relatively new in the history of Christianity. It was only in the late 1800s when we started to have specialization, and interestingly enough, people had more disposable income. When you have disposable income, then you can afford to hire somebody to do something. So as societies become more affluent, as our Canadian society became more affluent, there was more disposable income, we could afford to hire religious professionals. And one of the things that hiring religious professionals has often done is disempower the gifts that for so many centuries kept the Christian community going. And so now part of what we have to do is go back and refine some of those spiritual muscles. And we all know that if we haven't been using a muscle for a while and then decide we're going to start using it, it's not always the easiest and most comfortable thing to do. But if congregations can see the clergy as being partners rather than doers of ministry, if we can get past the capitalist notion of we pay you to deliver to us the religious goods and begin to recapture in very real ways the issues and questions and possibilities of discipleship, the reality is that the church can expand its mission, because if we depend on just one individual, I don't care how skilled they are, the limits of the ministry of a particular group of people are the limits of that one individual. But if we can move beyond that one individual and empower folks to act out of their spiritual giftedness, then the sky's the limit. Which also means that we have to do some more work in terms of helping our graduates know more about leadership development and discipleship and adult education, which is a whole nother learning about from folk who, when we ask them, what do you wish we had taught you? That's the sort of thing that they said. So there's information for another aspect of this, just very quickly, is to say that many of our judicatories, so regions and national, particularly region, still work with the idea of a full-time minister. When they set meetings, if you're full-time in ministry, then you can sort of go to meetings whenever, but if you're not, then that may be excluding you. Interestingly enough, most congregations support the involvement of their partially funded minister in the wider church, but only 50% of partially funded ministers report being involved in the wider church, which, when you consider the way our polity works in terms of the involvement of lay and ministry people in decision-making bodies, that points to a significant challenge coming down the road as this group of people grows. So there are learnings for congregations, for the theological institutions, and also for our structures as we live into this new reality.
Thank you, Ross. Your work brings together so much about ecclesiology, but mission and vocation and grace. This is important stuff, and it is changing things in the way we understand professional ministry, among other things. Thank you for taking us a little deeper into your work and getting our imaginations going with possibilities. Alexa, you've spoken a little bit about the needs in the community that your research is addressing, and a little bit about who your research findings are geared to. If you'd say a bit more of that, thank you, but also speak to the findings of your research, what you're discovering beyond what you've told us already. It's such a privilege to have this opportunity to go deeper into what you are working on. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Sure. Well, sometimes, there's the general and then the specific can be really helpful. So yesterday I met with a minister who raises $2,000 a week to help people pay for basic needs, food and shelter, bus tickets, $2,000 a week. And she was weeping because the need was growing and she cannot keep up. Today I'm in an old building that's leaking and has cracks across from Allen Gardens encampment, because we're going to talk, the minister here and I, about how to fund this and keep this ministry going. Like, we are in large ways failing Christ all over the place, in terms of the most vulnerable and the Matthew 25 passage. And to what Ross was saying, we need to empower more people to share their gifts, and more people, they want to. So what I discovered when we had the Kasuma family inside our church, was that I had to go out and ask for people to help. And these were religious people and non-religious people. And to a person, they said, "Thank you." My favorite example of that was, I said to a hairdresser, like, they've been with us a few months now, they can't leave the building, they don't have any money to pay you, you have to bring all your stuff here. Could you come and give them a haircut? And she said, "I've always wanted to do something good in the world, but all I know how to do is cut hair," right? And so what I'm discovering, and what we discovered at the church that I was serving for 10 years, was the more we went out, the more we became a place where discipleship was important, and mission, and caring for one's neighbor, and laying down one's life to find it. All those kinds of things were being practiced. Well, our givings went up 90%. Our M&S offerings went up 90%. Our membership doubled. Our Christmas Eve tripled. The only thing that actually stayed relatively static was our Sunday morning attendance. We had 200 neighbors that weren't congregants who signed up during the pandemic to support the work that we were doing. When I put a sign on the church saying we were feeding people in the pandemic and we needed help, we got $30,000 in donations. We normally get $6 in our benevolent fund. So the research that I'm the things that I'm finding is that the body of Christ is alive and well, but we don't always know how to harness it, and we don't know how to bring people into it, and we don't know how to sustain it. So Stone Soup in the local congregation is going to continue, the church that I've left, but we tried to replicate it. And in the end, I could not find a home in the church, in the national church, in the regional church, in any other body of the church, to house the work of reproducing Stone Soup. And so that is actually, after 400 new donors last year, after winning a citywide award in March, has just closed in April. So we have a very big challenge ahead of us in terms of these new ministries that can do so much good in the world, that the national church has funded, that people are part of. We get them to a certain point, but we don't know how to keep them going. So that's another piece of the work that I'll start to unpack and try to figure out how to give us some hope and some ideas and some thoughts about the next sort of social entrepreneur kind of ministry to get out there. How do we keep them going when they're in the middle of doing some pretty remarkable things of the Spirit?
Thank you. It's inspiring, and it's also a little bit shocking. We are so ridiculously human, but how to keep this going is what we're here to be talking about today. So thank you very much, Alexa, for taking us deeper into that work in all of those ways. Bill, speaking to the research you've been doing, if you speak a little bit more about the needs that that your research is addressing, and what you're finding. Thank you.
One of the unexpected journeys for me was around the brain. Not that I do have one, but one of the things that we would experience, we developed a commercial kitchen where newcomers could develop food industries. And we were always having conflicts. We'd have conflicts like this all the time. Oftentimes it would be, for instance, with the Filipino group or the Bhutanese group and the West Africans, and there would be things. And then in the middle of all of those conflicts, there would be some racial or cultural stereotyping that would go on. And so here we were in a context in which this was a reality of our giving. One of the main people was a woman named Janet Hirose, who is Japanese, and oftentimes the West African they would always call her, "Oh, that Chinese woman," "Oh, that Chinese woman." And so one of the pieces about disentangling ourselves enough to be able to actually engage with newcomers, with racialized, with the immigrant population that is the new Canada, is to get rid of the shame, guilt attachment to bias. Bias is a part of how our brains operate. We have bias. We will always have bias. It is a part of how the brain, and so then to deconstruct that piece of it, if guilt and shame worked, it wouldn't be that bad, but they don't. And so, so a part of it is, in order to free our minds to be able to engage with that person, we have to be able to, and it really is kind of very much in keeping with Buddhist teaching as well. We're not attributing some value to that. We're simply saying, "Oh, yes, that's a reality." And so a part of the research that surprised me in some ways was it was more in that area that we were able to equip people to engage with others who were different, who would have significantly different value systems and communication patterns and all of that stuff. So that was, I think, one of the changes in or the developments that was interesting for me. And the other piece of it was that welcome in the church so often means we get into radical hospitality. We welcome you to just as you are, to join with us just as we are. But there's another stage that we really need to go to, and that is to say, it's transformative. So we welcome you just as you are, to be with us just as we are, knowing that in the process we will both be changed. And so it's about equipping the body of Christ for that, I think. That's what the research was about.
Thank you. These fundamentally important questions, Bill, that you're getting at, that come to me as an individual, and I take it in and think of the communities I work with, coming out of the work that you're doing in that particular community. Thank you for sharing that. This understanding of the work that Ross and Alexa and Bill are each doing for themselves, for their communities, but also on our behalf, because we benefit from their work, brings us to the point of being hosted by the foundation today, and the way that we as church, through the foundation, are able to support the work that's happening. So I'm going to ask each of you this set of questions: how the scholarship impacted your journey, but also in that, how is it that you came to the foundation to make an application? How did you find the foundation? How did you decide that this would be an appropriate place to lodge your request for support? So how has it impacted your journey, and how did you get there? How did you get into the application process? And Ross, if you would begin, please.
Wow. I guess I've known that the United Church in various ways has supported research and scholarship ever since I was in my doctoral work way back when we had a division of ministry education and whatever it was, because part of my doctoral work was funded as a scholarship through there. So I always had the hope there, and I work with colleagues who have had United Church Foundation funding before. And when I began to realize the sheer scope of what I didn't know, and in fact, what we didn't know about this topic, I spoke to folk at the Office of Vocation who said to me, yes, it's something we need to know about, but it's not yet a priority on our many list of things to do. Okay, so now what? So it was the foundation that made possible the work that was centerpiece of this, which was the survey, because to engage a professional survey company to do something like this correctly, which is far above my skill level and more than I could really ask any friend to do. It needed money, and so that and made the whole thing possible. And in the current research, it's also allowed me to be in the same place as some of those folks. So I've just come back from being in Knox in Winnipeg, that Bill has been speaking about, talking with them about different sorts of ministries that might fit there. And and it's allowed for the publication of results. It's given me the time and space to conduct workshops with different groups of staff and folk, all the way in different ways. And it's just allowed the space in which to do this work and try and understand what this might look like.
Thank you, Ross. Bill, if you would speak to how it was that you came to make an application to the foundation and how that sponsorship, how that support has impacted your work.
It's not going to be awfully pretty. You know, when you work, much of my time in deaf ministry, a whole bunch of things, we were always making application for grants. And sometimes you'd look at it and say, well, what the hell, can't hurt. Basically, that was what happened with my application to the McGeachy. Oh, well, what the hell, that can't hurt. I'll put something in. And because so often grace breaks in. And in fact, that was in fact what happened. One of the changes in direction, I had originally imagined it as something like a book or something like that, and then Kate Rod at one point said, you know what, books, schmucks, and those workbooks, nobody gets them. What about podcasts, Bill? Why don't you do podcasts? So I said, that's a great idea, having never listened to a podcast in my life. I was just on my way out to Canmore, where we would test out the materials for 3 months. And I started, so that was what happened as a result of it. And it has afforded me that opportunity to explore those key questions of what is it that can equip regular folk in a pragmatic way to make changes to open themselves. And actually at Canmore, they came up with the term opening outwards, open out. As the how do we in fact do that? So they were fusing together their affirming process and this, and anyways, so that was.
Thank you. I could listen to you all day. Thank you very much. Alexa, if you would speak a bit, please, about how you came to apply for the McGeachy, how this support has affected your research.
Well, I mean, they're absolutely almost everything, because without the funding, we can't do the research. But it's also the experience of being empowered and believed in by the church, right? That we have this funding, that we say yes to it, that we and that we empower people to lead us in this way is huge. For me, it was a very interesting moment of deciding to apply for the McGeachy. I live in the mystic realm, so I tend to wait for a pull, a little notion. I disappear about 3 times a year for 3-4 days in the woods by myself, and I was on one of those in February of 2020 and felt this call to do some of this research and to really help churches kind of live into the call of out in the streets in Matthew 25 and pieces like that. And I was like, well, how am I going to do this? Like, where would I ever get money for it? And this little voice inside said, McGeachy. And I went, I think that's a fund in the church, but I'm not really sure. And I came home and Googled it. And sure enough, it was. And it was like I was 30 days away from the deadline, and it only happens every 2 years. And I thought, right, this is what I'm supposed to do, and it'll all be fine. and it was. So great gratitude that the fund exists and that the Spirit connects the funder and the researcher together to be able to provide the gift.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. As someone who has the privilege of sitting on the committee, as Sarah mentioned earlier, and receiving and reading the applications for research. First of all, congratulations to all of you. These are amazing grants, but they are amazing grants supporting your remarkable work that will change and reshape the church in so many different ways. I want to say it's a great privilege to sit as a member of that committee and see what interests my colleagues, what interests members of the church in our growth and our development, and that's not just a personal thing, although that is enough in itself, but that it benefits the wider church. There are a couple of questions in the chat, and you will notice that Sarah Charters has included the webpage from the Foundation for the Scholarship and Research Grants. There are many, and so depending on the kind of work that you're interested in, you may well find something that directly is helpful there. The other thing is, when you're meeting with friends and colleagues across the church, and you're hearing their ideas, invite them to look at this website, because we want to be supporting the wonderful ideas and works and possibilities across the church. There is a question from Jim Kay. We have about 6 minutes here. There is a question from Jim Kay about outreach ministries. It's directed to Alexa. Each of you in different ways are working on being greater than the introspective congregation. And so I'm just going to read the second part of the question here, which is, can the noise of the excitement of outreach ministries distract from the murmurs of need within the congregation? That's a very philosophical question. And if it touches on the work that you're doing, if you could speak briefly to that. Thanks, Alexa.
Sure. I think it's a Mobius strip. I think we go out and we go in, and we care for our own and we care for those outside. And I think you need both. I think part of the reasons why churches are dying is because they are largely seen as irrelevant to people around and even to congregants themselves. When COVID hit and people didn't have to go to church on Sunday morning, and then COVID lifted, people still didn't go back to church. There's something we're missing in terms of the need when we can compete with all these other things, right? And that's not everybody, and that's not every church. But I think what we might be missing is this thing inside us that is deeply needs to know that we are of value, that our gifts matter, that we were made for purpose. And I'm going to quote Ambry Stewart, who's on this call, that we are miracles 13.7 billion years in the making, and that we have something to give the world as well as receive. It's that stone soup piece of an onion, a carrot, all the rest. So I think it's a both and I think it's sometimes we tend to tip towards one or the other. And I'm really interested in encouraging us to live in that Mobius strip of the both and.
That's a marvelous image. Thank you very much, Alexa. That's a very helpful image. There is a long comment from Peter Denton that I offer to all of you for a moment to read. And I'm going to ask Ross and Bill to offer a closing comment in a moment. But I would like to lift up Harry Osorin's comment that as members who are on this committee, we did have requests for $290,000, and we were able to give away only $130,000. So we are hearing lots of interest across the church, and we want to promote that and amplify that. We also have room for contributions. And Sarah, that isn't what we were about today, but when you're talking with friends and colleagues and looking at your own outreach into the world, gifts toward this work will be well received and very, very well used. Ross, is there a closing comment you'd like to make, please?
Yeah, and yes, thanks. And it comes out of a very recent experience in southeastern Manitoba, meeting with two congregations that are doing some really interesting stuff around partially funded ministry. And the number of times congregants were so overwhelmed and surprised that anybody would come and listen to them, that they had something to teach, that some guy would come from Halifax to outside Winnipeg to find out what they had to learn. They were just so gratified at the idea that they had something to share with the rest of the church that was of worth. And that made the whole thing worthwhile, just to see them light up and recognize how their giftedness impacted the rest of us.
Marvelous. Thank you, Ross. Thank you. Bill, something you'd like to say in closing?
Nope.
Okay.
I can't think of anything. I was trying to think of something wise, but nothing came.
You have given us much wisdom. Thank you so very much. Alexa, is there a closing comment you'd like to bring?
I just think that this conversation has been so exciting because the church has this new tagline of bold discipleship and daring justice and deep spirituality. And we have a theological belief in death and resurrection. We are changing, and we will not know what the future looks like. But this conversation was pointing us in the ways in which God is right there at work, inviting us to be the church in this time and place and the church of the future. So I'm just very grateful for the folks on this call, the ways in which that research is moving out, the ways in which the church and the foundation is supporting that work, and the ways in which we'll get to participate it if we're brave, bold, and daring, in the future. So.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all three of you for being able to corral for our purposes the passion and the projects that you're working on to inspire us with the particulars, and also to bring us into how the foundation is supporting your work. Thank you very much. I have a closing blessing. Sarah, is there anything you'd like to say before others leave us?
I just want to express my gratitude for you, Catherine, and Alexa, and Ross, and Bill, and for all the sharing and time people have spent with us today. It's been really wonderful. So thank you very much.
Thank you. This blessing sounds familiar, and I want to credit William Sloane Coffin of the Riverside Church in the city of New York. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make the holy face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May God give you grace not to sell yourself short, grace to risk something big for something good, grace to remember that the world is now too dangerous for anything but truth, and too small for anything but love. May God take your minds and think through them. May God take your lips and speak through them. May God take your hands and work through them. May God take your hearts and set them on fire. Thank you, and a Merry Pentecost to you all.